With the second half of the run arriving just yesterday, it's the perfect time to answer one important question. Should you pull for them, or should you skip them? Today we are going to look at where PHAINON and Cyrene stands in the current meta compared to with their first release, discuss some important things you need to know about the character in today's environment, and finally go over the reasons why you should or should not consider summoning for them. Before we begin, please hit the like and subscribe button. Now if you have done that, let's get this video started. First, let's talk about PHAINON's place in the meta. PHAINON originally released back in version 3.4, which means it's been almost a full year since his debut. We are now just one patch away from version 4.4, and while a lot has changed in the game since then, surprisingly his base teams have not changed all that much. The biggest addition to his roster of teammates was Seridra, who arrived shortly after him. Since then, we have seen alternative team variations involving characters like Cyrene, Sparkle, and even sustained focus setups with Dan Heng. But outside of those additions, his core team structure has remained fairly similar. Back when PHAINON first released, one of his biggest strengths was flexibility. You could pair him with a wide variety of characters as long as they helped funnel resources into him and allowed him to reach his ultimate as quickly as possible. The goal was always to activate his ultimate under the right buffs, because once he enters ultimate state, those buffs are extended throughout the entire duration of his ultimate. Because of that, even characters like Yukong were surprisingly effective with him if you timed everything correctly before transforming. That flexibility was one of the reasons so many players loved him. There were countless combinations you could run, and he was not locked into a specific premium lineup. However, as time went on, that flexibility started to disappear. Nowadays, most players simply want to run the premium setup. Sparkle, Seridra, those are usually the core pieces people aim for. Cyrene can still work, but not in every situation. There are still some alternatives, of course. You can use Sunday instead of Sparkle, and there are other team variations that don't require Cyrene to instantly activate his ultimate. There are still multiple ways to play him. The difference is that those alternatives no longer feel as competitive as they once did. Compared to the early days when players were comfortably using Tingyun, Yukong, and other supports, the gap between premium and non-premium options has become much larger. Another area where PHAINON has aged is his damage performance at lower investments. One of the biggest issues with his kit always been the way his extra turns scale from base speed. There's very little you can do to improve that. His light cone and his E1 are basically the only ways to increase the speed of those extra turns during ultimate state. His signature light cone provides base speed, while E1 improves the inheritance ratio for ultimate's extra turn speed. This was always a weakness in his design, but during his release period, it was not nearly as noticeable because he was simply so strong. At launch, everyone was focused on how much damage he dealt, so a lot of those underlying issues were easy to overlook. But over time, those weaknesses became more apparent. Even back then, E0S0 felt little rough compared to the higher investment, although it was still perfectly playable. E0S1 felt good, E1 was decent if you happened to get unlucky and stop there. But E2 felt like an entirely different character, and honestly that's still true today. His E2 grants additional turns whenever he consumes 4 scorch tags during Meteor Fall, while also providing physical respan during ultimate state. Those extra turns are incredibly powerful. Combined with the speed improvements from E1 and the overall damage increase, it completely transforms how the character performs. You get more actions per cycle, more damage, and significantly better efficiency with action value management. Without those upgrades, PHAINON burns through action value extremely quickly, and if you are missing E1 or his signature light cone, it becomes even worse because not only are you acting slower, but you are also dealing less damage and struggling to secure kills that would otherwise improve your inheritance scaling. As a result, his performance at E0S0 and even E0S1 has gradually fallen behind compared to newer DPS options. But at E2 though, he's still incredibly strong. Honestly, E2 PHAINON is still one of the strongest DPS characters in the game, and that brings us to the biggest thing you need to consider before pulling. PHAINON is quite frankly an E2 character. It's impossible to ignore this. Playing him at E0 and playing him at E2 feels like playing two completely different units. Those extra turns, the physical respan, the smooth rotations, everything changes. Even if you are running strong supports like E0 Seridra and E0 Sparkle, or replacing one of them with Sunday, the character simply does not feel nearly as satisfying at lower investment anymore. Especially if you are using a sustain. PHAINON is already a character that burns through action value quickly. Without E2, the damage output just does not feel high enough to justify how much action value he's consuming. That's why E2 has become more and more important over time. Back when he's first released, it was a luxury. By his first rerun, it started to becoming a recommendation. Now during his second rerun, it honestly feels almost mandatory if you want to maximize this character. So should you summon? If you already own PHAINON and actively use him, my answer is simple. Yes, go for E2. Whether you are currently E0S0, E0S1, or somewhere in between, E2 is by far the biggest upgrade you can get. There is no investment that comes close. That's how impactful E2 is. It's the point where the character finally feels fully unlocked. And if you are considering pulling PHAINON for the first time, I honestly only recommend if you are willing and able to eventually reach E2. Yes, his LC is very strong, but E2 is significantly more important. As long as you can work toward E2, you will end up with a DPS that's still among the strongest in the game. Not the absolute strongest anymore, but definitely one of the best. Of course, you should also ask yourself whether your account actually needs another DPS. If your team's already covered and your resources are limited, it may not make sense to invest heavily into another damage dealer. You also want to make sure you have access to some of his key teammates. Cyrene is his biggest one. She's present in almost every one of his strongest teams. Having supports like Cyrene, Sparkle, and similar characters makes a huge difference. If you already have those pieces ready, PHAINON becomes a much more appealing option. Now let's talk about why you might want to skip. Honestly, the biggest reason is simple. Don't pull him if you can't realistically reach E2. If you are saving for Cyrene, or the upcoming 4.4 banners, or the Fate collaboration, then investing heavily into PHAINON probably is not the smartest choice. And if your account already has plenty of strong DPS units, that's another reason to pass. PHAINON requires a significant amount of investment to truly shine, and there are other DPS characters that provide stronger results at lower investment levels. Finally, let's talk about investment priority. This is probably the easiest recommendation. Go for E1 and then go for E2. That's it, no question asked. You do not prioritize Lightcon first. It will remain his biggest upgrade by a massive margin and is still the main reason he can compete with top tier DPS characters today. Without it, using him feels significantly more difficult than it used to. So if you are serious about investing in PHAINON, E2 should always be your first priority. And that's pretty much everything you need to know about his rerun. And then let's get to the second rerun banner in Phase 2, Cyrene. The big question is whether she's still worth pulling or if your Telerajates are better saved for upcoming characters. So let's break that down. Cyrene originally released in version 3.7 and until now, she has not had a rerun. This is officially her first rerun banner, which means it's been roughly 5 patches since her debut. When she first came out, she was marketed as the ultimate support for Crisis Air teams. However, her launch was not exactly smooth. There were several concerns that made a lot of players hesitant to pull immediately, with many deciding to wait for a future rerun instead. The biggest issue was her ultimate generation. At E0, charging her ultimate could feel fairly slow, and that became one of the most common complaints surrounding the character. While E2 solved that problem almost entirely. Many players were evaluating her at E0, where the issue was much more noticeable. Another factor was that not every Crisis Air character actually considered Cyrene part of their absolute base team. That created some uncertainty around her value, especially because one of those characters was PHAINON, who happened to be one of the most popular Crisis Air in the game. A lot of players struggled to justify pulling for a supposedly dedicated Crisis Air support when she was not automatically the best option in every Crisis Air composition. Outside of Crisis Air teams, her value also looked somewhat limited on paper. Her buffs mostly came in the form of true damage, damage bonus, and some personal damage contribution if she was receiving buff herself. Because of that, many players felt she did not offer enough flexibility beyond her intended archetype. Those were the main criticism people had after her release. However, once players spent more time testing her, it became clear that Cyrene was still an incredibly valuable support. The reality was that most Crisis Air teams still wanted her. PHAINON was one of the few exceptions, and even then, there were situations where Cyrene remained a strong option, particularly if you had access to her E2. Another situation where she was not immediately dominant involved dot teams. At the time, the premium dot lineup was not fully available yet, so Cyrene occasionally filled that third slot. If you wanted to maximize her performance there, E2 was usually recommended. Now that we have more complete dot teams featuring characters like Kafka and Black Swan, Cyrene's position has become more specialized. In talent setups, she can still be extremely strong, though in some cases, players may prefer alternatives like Mortonix Blade. For standard sustain teams, however, the court remains Kafka, Black Swan, High Silence, and Sustain, leaving a little less room for Cyrene than before. Outside of the situations, characters like Mayday, Anaxia, Agoya, 3B, Cypher, and many hybrid compositions all benefit tremendously from what Cyrene provides. Even PHAINON benefits greatly from Cyrene's buff. Being able to remain in his empowered state for longer periods is extremely valuable in extended fights, though some matchups still favor alternative setups that focus on cycling his ultimate more frequently. Despite the concerns surrounding her launch, most players eventually came to the same conclusion. Cyrene truly is dedicated support for Crisis Air teams, with only a handful of exceptions. And if you invested into her E2, her value expanded even further. Suddenly, she became useful in teams that simply appreciated faster ultimate generation and access to additional ultimate gauge filling. That's part of why characters like Saber and more recently Venetia can make excellent use of E2 Cyrene setups. Because of that, her overall value has not really declined over time. If anything, she's become more account dependent. If you are someone who frequently plays teams built around characters like Anaxia, Mayday, or various Remembrance archetypes, Cyrene is still incredibly valuable pickup. At this point, it's pretty well established that if you are heavily invested in Crisis Air related teams, Cyrene remains one of the most important support characters you can own. So that's all for 4.3 reruns analysis. Are you guys going to invest in these two characters, or are you planning to save for Himeko Nova instead? Please share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this video helpful, please hit the like and subscribe button, turn notification as well so you won't be missing out on any of my style content. I will see you guys on my next one. Bye bye!